Hi, today we're going to talk about the four main biomolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and how they connect to the structure and function of cells. Hopefully, you'll see how these molecules explain real-world phenomena, like why an athlete might collapse after a marathon, or how DNA can help solve crimes. So, let's think of this with a guiding question. How do different biomolecules determine the structure and function of cells? So as we go through, keep this question in mind. Every fact we cover today should connect back to how molecules build and power cells. All right, let's take a look at this picture. This is an Olympic runner who has collapsed after a race at the Olympics. And the link for this article is below the picture. So why does this happen? So let's think about that. So what could lead to a Olympic athlete, somebody in peak physical form, collapsing after a race or even during a race? This type of thing has happened before. So I want you to think about this. We're not going to write anything down today about this. It's not a phenomenon study. It's just a thought exercise to help clarify some of our thoughts on this and help us make some connections as we go through more information about biomolecules. So first, we already talked about cellular respiration. We've seen this diagram before, how we're producing ATP in different stages of cellular respiration, whether it's in glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or in the electron transport chain. So carbohydrates are for quick energy. They're for energy storage and structural support. So carbohydrates are very important. The example would be glucose in cell respiration. We need to take in glucose so that we can then convert it into this usable energy of ATP. So carbohydrates are the body's quick energy source. That's something that you definitely want to commit to memory. They're the quick energy source. Glucose is a sugar. It's broken down in the mitochondria to release energy. That energy fuels everything your cells do. Carbohydrates can also store energy short term. This would be like glycogen in your muscles. And carbohydrates build structures like cellulose in plants. Think of carbohydrates as the fuel that helps your cells do work. So next, let's talk about lipids. Lipids, these are your long-term energy storage. They're for insulation, membranes, signaling within your cells. A great example, and we've already seen this, is that phospholipid bilayer in the plasma membrane, where you have your hydrophilic, your water-loving head, and then attached to it is the hydrophobic, the water-heating tail. And they are meshed together, so tail to tail, and the heads are separated by the tails. This isn't something that we talk about with lipids because think about when you've maybe gotten something fatty like butter or oil on your hands. That's a lipid, and it's slick. It's hard to wash off without soap because of the hydrophobic tendency for some lipids. So what do you think that phospholipid bilayer has as a major component of it? Lipids. And lipids are fats, oils, and phospholipids. These store your long-term energy. They're also important for insulation and protecting organs as well. So they're doing different jobs. But most importantly, they form the cell membrane. That phospholipid bilayer, in my opinion, is one of the just absolute most awesome things. It lets our cells have control over what enters and leaves So it's very important for proper cell function and homeostasis. So lipids, these are also chemical messengers like steroid hormones. So the lipids do a whole bunch of things for us. I always say your brain loves cake because your brain is always craving sugar and fats, and so your carbohydrates and your lipids. Without lipids, cells wouldn't have protective barriers or ways to send signals or information. So lipids are super important. And I know, even though we've talked about it, what's the phospholipid bilayer? And even though we've talked about it before, it's always a great question because we don't want to have questions that are left unanswered. The phospholipid bilayer is one of the most important concepts in cell biology. Each phospholipid has two parts. I already talked about them. The hydrophilic head, it's water-loving. It's made of phosphate and glycerol. And the tails are hydrophobic. They're water-hating or water-fearing. And those are made of fatty acids, lipids. When many phospholipids are in water, they line up head to head and tail to tail, and they form a bilayer, just like this little picture is illustrating, even though it's not the best picture. The heads face outwards towards the watery environment, inside and outside, and the tails face inward, away from the water, forming a hydrophobic core. So right here, we can see this area between the hydrophobic tails is that core area that I just talked about. So that's this area in between. And this hydrophobic core with the tails on either side and the hydrophilic heads at each tail, it forms a selective barrier. This bilayer makes the barrier that separates the inside of the cell, the cytoplasm, from the outside environment. You have small nonpolar molecules like oxygen or carbon dioxide that can pass through. You have larger or charged molecules like glucose or ions, and those usually need help from transport proteins. The fluid mosaic model comes to mind because that bilayer is fluid. The phospholipids can move around, just like people in a crowd can move around even if it feels crowded. Proteins are mosaic pieces that float in the bilayer, and they act as channels or pumps or even receptors, because remember, communication and recognition is also going to be taking place. We have proteins and carbohydrate chains that attach to the bilayer, and that would allow cells to recognize signals like hormones and also to interact with other cells. Some protection that this offers, well, it keeps harmful substances out while allowing nutrients in. A good analogy that I think of is to think of this phospholipid bilayer as a bouncer at a club. The bilayer is the wall around the club, which the club would be the cell in this analogy. And those hydrophobic core, that's like the velvet rope. And most people, molecules, can't get through. Proteins are the bouncers and the doors, and they decide who gets in or out. So that's how I think about it. You might have a better analogy, and if you do, please share it. I'd love to hear it. Okay. Proteins. We've talked a lot about proteins, and we've talked about them in the form of cell organelles, like ribosomes that are going to be producing proteins. And we talked about ribosomes a whole chock-a-block lot because proteins do almost everything in the cell. They build structures like muscles, they transport molecules like oxygen, that's hemoglobin's job, and they speed up chemical reactions when they're enzymes. So proteins shape, that's a key component here. Just like with our enzyme talk where we had that lock and key model, proteins shapes are important. If a protein is folded wrong, it doesn't work. That's why we say structure determines function. Proteins are like the workers inside of a cell. They're always building, moving, and catalyzing reactions. So proteins, they're going to act as enzymes or structural proteins. They can do transport, they can communicate. So very much is reliant on proteins. So that's why we talked a lot about ribosomes previously. Okay. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA that store and transmit genetic information. DNA holds the instructions for making proteins, and RNA helps carry out those instructions. I like to think of DNA as the instruction manual for the cell, and proteins as the workers that carry out the instructions. Without nucleic acids, cells couldn't pass on traits or make the proteins they need. So, nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, they are going to store and transmit genetic information. That's the big idea here. So now let's connect some things. We've talked about cell organelles in the past, and I already talked about ribosomes and proteins. But let's connect each biomolecule to its place in the cell. Well, carbohydrates are used by mitochondria for energy. Lipids form the cell membrane. Proteins are built at ribosomes and do the work inside the cell. And nucleic acids in the nucleus store the instructions. So together, all of these molecules make cells run smoothly. And we all know every living thing is made out of cells. All cells come from pre-existing cells. And it all connects to our biomolecules. So neat. All right, so let's revisit that Olympic runner, the marathon runner who collapsed after their race. When the runner collapses, it's because their carbohydrate stores are depleted. They've burned through all the glucose and glycogen. Their proteins, the enzymes and muscle fibers, are still working, but they can't keep up without energy. Lipids might also be used for some of that long-term energy, but they're just released too gosh darn slow, so it's not going to help keep them upright after they've depleted all of their other resources. They will use that primarily for recovery. And we'll talk more about these biomolecules and how they interact with us in our day-to-day living. And if there's any questions, always ask. All right, now it's your turn to put this together. Your claim would be each biomolecule has a unique role that supports cells. Well, the evidence, I want you to choose an example. Either pick carbohydrates fueling ATP production, lipids and membranes being that selective barrier, maybe enzymes speeding up reactions, or DNA storing information. Pick an example, any example, this is your choice, but I want you to be very careful with your reasoning. Reasoning is not a restatement of evidence or a restatement of your claim. I want your reasoning to explain why the structure of that biomolecule allows it to do its job. And remember, with proteins, we talked very clearly about how the structure of protein dictates how it can be used. So structure and function are connected, and we haven't talked at length about it, so I want this to be an opportunity for you to write a short paragraph or even discuss it together with your table partner and figure out how that structure determines function. And we will revisit this in class, and we'll talk about it as a large class discussion later. All right, so for a wrap up, I want you to let me know inside your notebook, just write today's date and then exit ticket. Which biomolecule stores heredity information, so things that are inherited. And I also want you to answer, why is protein structure important for its function? So if you had a good discussion during that CER, that would be awesome. You could write some of your evidence, some of your reasoning with that for your exit ticket. That's entirely fine. You don't need to always rework the wheel here. So I want to just make sure that how you're answering these questions are going to let me read when I check your notebooks and see how this information, how the connections are being formed. So again, let's connect these molecules that we've talked about to how cells work, because we know that, and we now know a lot more about these biomolecules. So I can't wait to talk to all of y'all later about this. Have a great day.